Let's talk about Briar. From Riot August's long-standing desire to create a proper vampire comes Briar, one of the most unique divers we've seen to date. Briar's gameplay is the League of Legends equivalent of frantically trying to wrestle a fork away from a child dangerously close to an electrical socket, and honestly, I love that for her. As usual, I got together with my community to test Briar, learning everything we can about her pre-release. In this video, we will be exploring Briar's basic abilities, ability usage principles, skill point distribution, purpose and playstyle, viable roles, draft conditions, runes, and itemization. While this guide is written with awareness that she's intended as a jungler, we will just as much cover her needs as a top laner. Briar's passive is a stacking bleed. Briar's attacks and abilities add a stack of bleed to enemies for 5 seconds, stacking up to 9 times. The first stack deals full damage. All subsequent stacks deal 25% damage for a total of 3 times the passive's damage. Briar will also heal for 25% of the pre-mitigation damage dealt by the bleed, and if the target dies, she will heal for 100% of the remaining bleed's damage, effectively a mini triumph. Additionally, Briar has no health regeneration, but will increase incoming healing from all sources based on her missing HP. 1% missing HP translates linearly to 0.5% increased healing. Skipping ahead to the core of her kit, Briar's W empowers her attacks but inflicts Berserk on herself. On cast, Briar dashes to the target location. The dash behaves like Flash in that if you would travel more than halfway across terrain, you will cross the wall. Then, if there is an enemy within range, she gains the Blood Frenzy buff for 5 seconds. While under Frenzy, Briar gains significant bonus attack speed, bonus movement speed, and an AoE cleave on her auto attacks, but she also goes Berserk, targeting any nearby enemy unit, regardless of whether she has vision or not. Briar prioritizes champions, then large monsters while Berserk. If there are no longer any enemy units to hit, Blood Frenzy will end. Additionally, Briar can use all of her spells, summoner spells, and items while Berserk, and gains access to her W2 once per cast while buffed. Briar's W2 is an auto attack reset that heals herself significantly. On cast, Briar's next attack gains 50 bonus range, deals bonus physical damage based on the target's percent missing HP, and heals Briar for a high percentage of post-mitigation damage dealt. This spell is Briar's core moment of power. Briar's Q is a targeted dash that damages and stuns the enemy, also reducing their armor for a duration. She may target an allied unit to dash without dealing damage. If cast on a non-champion during her W, Briar will stop prioritizing champions. It's a simple but very strong spell. Briar's E is a defensive channel that heals herself, disrupts enemies, and most importantly, cancels her own Berserk. On cast, Briar begins to channel, ending the effects of her W and increasing the damage and range of her spell. While channeling, she gains damage reduction and heals for a percentage of her max HP every quarter second. On release, the wave deals magic damage to all enemies within the area and slows them heavily for 0.5 seconds. If fully channeled, the wave will also knock enemies a fixed distance backwards, stunning them and dealing absurd damage if they collide with terrain. The channel cannot be interrupted by any CC. Briar's ultimate is a near-global linear skill shot that causes her to dash unstoppably towards her target in an empowered Blood Frenzy state. After a long cast time, a long channel on impact, and the dash, Briar will deal physical damage to her target and to all enemies around them, fearing her secondary targets. She will then go Berserk until that target enemy is dead, or until she is dead. While in this empowered frenzy, Briar gains bonus resistances, lifesteal, and additional bonus movement speed on top of the effects of W. If at any point her target becomes invalid, she will attack any other enemy until her primary target becomes valid again. While in this state, W is no more than a simple dash that grants access to W2, Q will never change Briar's target, and E will still cancel Berserk. Despite the fact that Briar has a simple auto-attacker's kit, since her gameplay loop revolves around applying CC to herself, she actually has some complex ability usage principles. So first, let's observe how her entire kit revolves around the W. If Briar does not cast W, her DPS and defenses are unimpressive for a melee champion. If she does cast W, she will attempt to all-in, even if that means turret diving or sprinting into enemy spells. That means that by default, you'll want to hold your cooldowns to support your W, and you can't go for safe near-turret burst that other champions could. You should only fight without your E if you have guaranteed lethal off some existing advantage. And that means we have to be super selective with our E casts. It's our greatest defensive tool, our only way to control a fight, our greatest damage by far. It's an important spell, but it can't be cast without effectively ending combat for us. Throwing the enemy away means that Briar can opt out of most single file fights as long as the enemy isn't right on top of her. But when she disengages, if her bleed isn't enough to kill, she has to wait for her W to come back to have impact. Then her E's cooldown is too long to support this next W, assuming the enemy re-engages at all. If you can survive your first W without casting E, it's often better to hold for the second in a fight, and that optimizes its healing via passive as well. Casting E offensively is so difficult. This spell isn't designed to hit terrain. It can only be confirmed by Q onto no mobility targets without tenacity with a positional advantage for Briar. If you have CC help from your allies, by all means open with E, nuke a target, and finish them off with W. If you have bush control, by all means go for Scion-esque ambushes, as long as you can't be retaliated against for missing, because you won't be able to W over terrain for an escape without E. W2's damage, and therefore its healing, scales with missing HP. You want to cast it at the last moment of your W as an auto reset if possible, casting earlier only if your target would escape, if you would die without the immediate heal, or if the W2 is already lethal. Q is one of the strongest proactive tools in the game. It's Jack's Q with a shred and a stun, limited only by Briar's committal kit. You cast it early when you want to fight someone, or hold it to interrupt any key channels. WQ Flash optimizes for reach at the cost of control. While laning, clearing, or taking objectives, you should hold your Q if you believe an enemy champion who cannot kill you is going to interrupt your PvE. In lane, if your enemy can't dive you, but you can't run them down either, you're almost always going to be casting WQ onto your crashed waves for some outstanding sustain. Briar's ultimate grants far too much power to be thrown recklessly. You will stifle all of your snowball potential if you're fishing for random full-range ults. So, the most honest and consistent way to cast is to fire at close range at the start of a small skirmish, layered with CC or catching the enemy in an animation. That said, the range is part of the spell's power. If a distant enemy is reliably stuck in a small choke point, a turret dive, attacking or defending, an objective pit, a recall, or especially an active trade in lane from a vertical angle, feel free to fire. Note that the ultimate makes a global noise, so even though your enemies might not know who your target is until it's too late, you still need to anticipate how your enemy will dodge. Since Briar's ultimate has an AoE fear, she is capable of taking a short duel against a target within a clump, but be careful when you're actually fighting with your ult rather than taking picks. You may need to cast a W to dodge spells or to unlock W2, which means that your W might be on cooldown when your target dies, and you'll be forced to retreat. So in case it wasn't obvious, our skill points are going towards W. Look at it, there is no argument against investing into this many stats. Afterwards, invest points into your Q for the cooldown and armor reduction. There's almost no reason to go beyond 1 point in E because remember, we're not expected to land the damage and we can't use its heal without ending our fight. In the jungle, I like to start with WEQ, and in top lane, I like to take EQW to survive her early laning weakness. More on that later. Briar is an all-in diver who preys on aggressive lanes from great distances and who dominates small skirmishes if protected from herself. She is fundamentally aggressive. She should close the game through an early snowball, but she has to build herself up a bit before that snowball can begin. There is so much 1v1 power baked into Briar's kit. She's got one of the strongest attack speed steroids in the game and an absurd combat swing in W2, but that power is gated behind a few levels and a little bit of gold. And that makes Briar a tempo jungler, a champion who prefers to full clear until she hits her major spikes, which is, of course, her ultimate. Once Briar's ultimate is online, it's time to start sating her bloodthirst. While farming, you should constantly survey the map for reliable ults. As mentioned earlier, we're looking for specific moments that tell us our enemies won't simply walk away from the projectile. We're looking for unfair fights. And once we've found our first unfair fight and built an item lead, it's time to start pushing the tempo. Look for invades against the enemy jungler, look to gank frozen lanes, then immediately ult to the next lane. Look to dive with your ultimate since your ult Berserk won't trap you under turret after securing your kill. Look to contest all possible objectives, abuse mispositioned enemies from across the map. Keep your farm up, but start skipping camps if a good play is available. We want violence. With the caveat that the uncontrollable Briar is far stronger when going second in an honest fight. So don't try to hard 1v9. You want to capitalize on teammates starting skirmishes for you. Now, Briar isn't completely dependent on her ultimate. That becomes most clear when looking at the playstyle of top lane Briar. In that role, she is horribly weak pre-3 and must play for the first rebound wave, but once that happens, once she has all her spells, she's almost always ready to take a trade if she can dodge even one key enemy tool. Against champions that can't respond to her W with immediate death or drawn-out kiting, it's easy to fight proactively, but that's mainly because top lane Briar has the luxury of watching a single enemy until they make a micro mistake, of controlling a lane state with good wave clear, high sustain, and devastating threat on a freeze. Jungle Briar can't, at least not without slowly falling behind on very necessary XP, and that's why she relies on her ultimate more. So the lesson is that Briar, no matter the role, is always looking for enemy mistakes because she is capable of fighting. If you're a jungler, your camps are down, and you're playing opposite sides, try using Briar's top lane short trade pattern just to incite chaos in the lane. A reality of Briar is that she's going to rack up a few deaths even if piloted well. You're not going to opt out of diving a top laner with 3 stacked waves just because your Berserk will trap you under turret. That XP swing for your top laner is too valuable for your overall snowball. Sometimes you will kill 2 key targets, securing a major objective, but because your Berserk lasted an extra second, you find yourself wildly out of position afterwards. Don't be afraid to make good plays that result in your death, because Jungle Briar does need to dirty up the game to win. If Briar manages to get into a teamfight situation, she's not thrilled. A failure to secure a pick presents her with the idea of sprinting directly into 5 people as her only contribution. Not great! So if a teamfight is brewing, Briar has 3 options. The first is to play the flank looking for an edge teamfight, a duel or 2v2 separate from the main fight. The second is to wait for her teammates to initiate and find an ult on a priority target using the fear to win the fight directly. That's my favorite option, but it puts faith into your team and is more likely to trade kills. The third is to sit on top of your fed carries and peel with Q and E. This option is not desirable much of the time because it further limits your good Ws, but Briar is completely useless from behind, as most Drain champions are. If you're not the win condition anymore, peeling might be your best option. That brings us to the issue of drafting Briar, and let me just preface this by saying, I think Briar looks like a great solo queue champion. Solo players cannot possibly track everything, and Briar will find windows. But when it comes to coordinated play, I struggle to find a real niche in which Briar looks like the best choice. As a jungler, she's not entirely in control of her own snowball. Granted, her ult is a good tool that the enemy jungler can't always match. But are you sure you wouldn't rather play Nocturne? I think on a theory level, she's actually stronger as a top laner, but she's not without major weaknesses and volatility. Her matchup spread looks like it may be similar to Irelia's, and Irelia's matchup spread is polarizing at best. While the matchup spread of a jungler doesn't usually matter, good luck into Master Yi, Elise, Gwen, Fizz, Vladimir. A champion who goes untargetable and breaks your Berserk is nearly unfightable. She has some absurd synergy points with Enchanters. Our most dominant in-house game featured a Soraka mid, so if a unique competitive niche exists, it probably has something to do with the hypercarry Enchanter archetype. But as of now, it looks like the best reason to pick Briar is because you like to play Briar, and that's fair, I like Briar. It's just not compelling at a competitive level. Moving on to items, while Briar does draw from a pool of bruiser items, I don't think we can claim she follows standard bruiser itemization. Let's start by taking inventory of what we have to optimize. We have our passive healing amp. Our greatest nuke, W2, applies lifesteal with a very high AD ratio, but there's very little lifesteal in Briar's kit already. We have one of the best attack speed steroids in the game, which implies we don't need to build attack speed, but that we do apply on hits very well. We have an obligation to deal high DPS, but also an obligation to get some defenses because we just can't support committal melee lifesteal without effective HP. Much of our sustain is optimized by penetration. Ability haste translates to healing via W2, but only after our AD is online. And so this leaves Briar with a sharp curve. She needs immediate damage, but must pivot very quickly into survivability. I don't think she has core stats. She just has a specific stat she wants on each item purchase. We're mainly buying for the passives. So I think Briar makes unique decisions each game from this small pool of items. She'll purchase many of them each game, just in a different order each time. On first item, we're looking for damage and sustain. Blade of the Ruined King and Gore Drinker are my 2 most appealing rush options, generally in top and jungle respectively. Then we're looking for a pivot point, a defensive damage item. I expect our options in this slot to be Black Cleaver, Gore Drinker, Divine Sunderer, Wit's End, and an unusually early Death Stance for the reasons listed on screen. Next, we try to build up our defenses with an impactful passive, looking for haste if we don't already have any. I'd be looking here at Death Stance, Spirit Visage, Iceborne Gauntlet, Guardian Angel, and again, Black Cleaver. Note that a Bork Cleaver path is viable, so it's possible we're Mythicless on third. And then we'll close out our build with full durability items because Briar will naturally start to fall off by this point, and we'll just need to survive as long as possible to have impact. We'll talk about why I opted out of certain options. No Trinity Force because Briar's base AD is far too low for a melee. I avoid Stride Breaker because it's competing with higher synergy items, and I personally don't find it slow to create many more windows. You may disagree. It's certainly weak as a rush on Briar, second item only. I avoid my beloved Sterix until the very end of my build, in part because of low base AD, but also because Briar needs resistances from her third item more than she needs extra HP. And there's some funny builds going around. Quick Blades as a rush item looks poor. W won't benefit from Quick Blade's passive until after you spend W2, which encourages you to cast it too early. Ginsu's could be okay with a boatload of enchanters behind you, but our defenses are poor. Duskblade and Eclipse actually look decent, but I'm not sure where they slot into Briar's curve. Her itemization is not solved, so experiment within reason, but focus on learning the champion first. For runes, we're running a precision tree. We have no need for more attack speed, so we default to Conqueror, but I also do like fleet footwork in some risky top lane scenarios since we're amplifying its value with passive. I support these with Overheal if I'm rushing a lifesteal item, Triumph otherwise, then Legend Bloodline and Last Stand. Resolve for Revitalize is a natural partner, especially for top lane, but I'm not sold on conditioning value with Briar's itemization in the jungle. I suppose you can't go wrong with Ultimate Hunter and Cheap Shot or Sudden Impact, but it feels wrong to skip Revitalize? Runes clearly aren't solved either. So that's Briar, the Restrained Hunger. This is a weird champion who takes a lot of time to get used to. I wouldn't be surprised if it took more than 50 games to get a proper feel for what she can do, especially since she's so feast or famine. But she's a lot of fun, and her gameplay really reflects the feeling of trying to control this uncontrollable monster. It's a very cool design. Now, if you do want to help others control her, I invite you to share what you learned in the comments below, because we certainly couldn't have learned everything about Briar in just the time we had. Thank you so much to my patrons, SonicX5040, Mel7401, Hailfire, and Darwin. Your support makes these videos possible.